It's not every time we are given an anime that would just surprise us with such great details and intricacy put into its world, characters, and the overall story. Especially from an isekai anime, the most polarizing genre of the last decade and unsurprisingly up until this day. While Mushoku Tensei pretty much didn't bring anything new to the table when it comes to the general idea of what makes up an isekai anime, well, that statement will be contradictory to the legacy of Mushoku Tensei being the progenitor of the modern isekai trends. But what it manages to bring into the table that countless isekais, even critically acclaimed ones, failed to do so, is polishing the premise of what made isekais great in the first place. For years, we have seen countless of isekai shows introducing us with the most generic protagonist we could ever hope for, the most generic fantasy world we could imagine, and storytelling that would make the last few episodes of Darling in the Franxx a masterpiece in comparison. Some notable shows are outstanding in their own rights but didn't make that big of an impact that would change our opinions on the whole genre. Which brings us to Mushoku Tensei, which in itself is already praised by many, being the best if not the peak of what isekais can do. A show that would define the genre for a very long time, and would be a testament that isekais can become a standout show despite its oversaturation. Which begs the question, what makes Mushoku Tensei the best isekai anime? Mushoku Tensei is world building at its finest. The details that it brought into its fantasy world is just outstanding, a feeling that we're all too familiar with the likes of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy, bringing us to an expansive fantasy world that we will be eager enough to explore and be a part of, which translate to the scope and potential that Mushoku Tensei has with its world, characters, and overall storytelling, being without a doubt unmatched by the current isekai standards, perfecting what I truly believe the other isekai shows lack in comparison and failed to capture, and that is making a believable fantasy world. World building lays the groundwork for your characters to develop, providing the stage for where your creation will perform. When you build a world, you include the landscape that your characters will inhabit, the tone of your story, its major preoccupation and themes, as well as the nature of its morality. For writers, it is a starting point on where to establish the rules and boundaries of your imaginary world and how everything exists within it. These are the ideas behind what makes a believable world, a guide into world building. And what's my point here? Well, Mushoku Tensei, being a good all-around anime as it is, made full use of its world unlike any isekais before it. It doesn't just show us that it is a fantasy world, but it immerses us along with it. From the theme and setting, to the music, to the underlying history and lore, Mushoku Tensei manages to capture every single detail on making a believable world. Not that it hasn't been done before in an anime format, but I feel like this time it feels a lot more genuine, more calculated than just a story that is set in this Tolkien-inspired fantasy setting, because Mushoku Tensei presented its world as part of the story itself. Every detail presented to us give us hints, foreshadowing what might soon be relevant to the story, characters that are in some ways connected to one another, and just the lore and culture that inhabits Mushoku Tensei's world is just outstanding in such detail that is unseen before in the genre, where everything has a purpose and relevance to the overarching story, and the added detail of presenting to us a visually stunning fantasy world which shows how an amazing work of art Mushoku Tensei is, resulting in a believable and immersive world that is intriguing and serve as the stage for where the characters perform and where the story shall unfold, which lead me to state one of the strengths of Mushoku Tensei, which is its story. Mushoku Tensei pretty much runs through every isekai tropes that we already know of, but what it differs that it's more polished and structured in a way that is more grounded than with the other isekais before it. The story didn't start off with a clear goal and just set off on a grand adventure. As a matter of fact, Mushoku Tensei started off with the general feeling of a slice of life anime, depicting one of the most mundane things to do in this fantasy world, relatable conflicts and just outright comedic banters with the characters throughout the first few episodes, which made our first few impressions of Mushoku Tensei such a cozy anime to watch, which only shows the duality of the series, as this became prominent in the later volumes of the light novels as well, where we are just presented with the daily life of our characters and how each one of them intertwined with one another. It's refreshing in a genre that is filled with just power fantasy action and bland filler episodes that would only give way for occasional fan service and separating itself from the main story. Not that Mushoku Tensei lacks in the fan service and power fantasy department. As a matter of fact, it utilizes these tropes with a certain purpose, and we understand that because the show itself is well aware of what's its premise and who are its characters. While in the action side of things, it's one of the best shows to be immersed with just pure high fantasy action. But Mushoku Tensei integrated these casual slice of life scenes in the story as entertaining as its action side of things, and purposely made it to be part of the whole premise that Mushoku Tensei is aiming for, which is following the eventful life and adventures of its characters. For once, we actually have an isekai putting the age progression somewhat naturally than with the other isekai shows sporting the same premise. It literally feels like as if we're tagging along on this grand adventure. And where Mushoku Tensei shines with its story the most is when it becomes serious. It lets us feel as if everything is at stake. It doesn't shy away from showing us the drama and the darker side of this fantasy world that our characters inhabit, where it isn't all fun and games and there are no second chances. It doesn't go as far as being just a goofy isekai anime where we have an OP protagonist that would one-shot every enemy he encounters. Our protagonist is surely strong for this world and his age, but it doesn't give him the upper hand to someone who has more experience than with the power he has. Sure, he becomes victorious at some of these fights, but either with the help of another character. And some of these later fights even show how powerless he is regardless of the advantages he has. Despite being comedic in theme and execution, the show is well aware of its trope as it should be, and it takes its story seriously when it wants to take it seriously, which I admire so much as to how flexible the show is from a storytelling perspective. Key events just seemingly happen with the clear intent of story progression and not just outright forced conflicts just to drive the show's excitement, which made Mushoku Tensei shine from the pool of isekai shows before it, where there is always that heavy anticipation of what might soon come up with the story next, because Mushoku Tensei built its story on how and where our characters progresses. It's dynamic and makes us feel that we are experiencing the adventure, the drama, and how it let us be immersed with the characters and story as much as the world itself. But looking deeply enough to understand Mushoku Tensei's underlying story, we have to understand the inclusion of the main character himself and how this story revolves around this one character. Mushoku Tensei is an example of an isekai trope done right. The idea of reincarnation flows perfectly with this show, as it simply follows the continuous growth, events, and the character development of someone receiving a second chance in life, the life of our protagonist, Rudius Greyrat. As he got reincarnated in this fantasy world and with the memory of his previous life, meeting people and getting tangled on key events that drive the story progression, we are witnessing a character as he grows and realizes things that he hasn't experienced in his previous life, which made him the perfect protagonist of the story going forward. Rudius, or to be specific, his original self, is not your run-of-the-mill isekai protagonist. He is in no way a Kirito clone, well in fact he is much worse than his previous incarnation in the genre. He isn't just a jobless NEET, but he is someone who is well over the territory of an ugly bastard and someone who is a complete jerk, which starts off already with a reputation that doesn't fit him well to be a main character. And I also thought at it at first, thinking that I may not be able to stand such a controversial character in my anime, but for some reason, I actually grew to like him as a protagonist. Well, for once we actually felt closer to a character, not by his action, but we know for a fact that he is a flawed character right at the start. He is pretty much personifying someone in the real world, having been bullied and is suffering from social anxiety, which caused most of his undesirable traits at the start. He carried these flaws and anxiety he already has along with him in this new world and solved it in each step of his way, experiencing new emotions and even regrets, which made this irredeemable character slowly redeem himself in front of us as he developed even further, which made the inclusion of his character in story so meaningful. The show isn't just about adventures or just the perverted thoughts and action of an adult inside the body of a child, but it runs deeply with its character as well. This idea of emotional growth resonates with Mushoku Tensei's character, but it doesn't hide the fact that the show will just neglect the idea that the protagonist has the mind of a 34-year-old virgin otaku, and as much as how controversial he is as a character and with his action, I genuinely felt it's a well-added detail that stayed true to the character of Reduced Grey Rat, a 34-year-old NEET in the body of a child. The characters that goes alongside Rudeus in this fantasy world are also interesting and are well written, becoming a detail that would also resonate in the show's premise as it involves Rudeus meeting these recurring characters throughout his adventures. And this premise of age progression on Mushoku Tensei made the show appealing as it wants us the viewers to look forward to the characters' growth throughout their time and experiences, a detail that some isekai shows will just neglect right at the start. Mushoku Tensei would go down as one of the most influential series in the medium of anime, spawning dozens of shows, mangas, and even other mediums of the otaku culture to be inspired by it. With the addition of its anime being faithfully adapted from the light novels, would definitely light hope to a genre that is currently a running joke in the community. Mushoku Tensei shows what potential in terms of visual, world building, and storytelling can the isekai genre achieve if done with care and thought. Shows like The Rising of the Shield Hero and ReZero are just some examples of isekai shows being made with careful thought with its world and storytelling that resonate with the community. Sure, there is some room for trashy isekai shows or just anime in general as it what makes the medium so interesting. But the isekai genre can become a great concept, and Mushoku Tensei is definitely a show that brings that concept into a great anime and deserves its recognition as one of the best anime to be brought into the medium. The story, characters, and the world are just amazing that made me check out and finish the light novels even before the anime even started, and reading through it gave me one of the most exciting, most emotional, and wholesome storytelling I ever encountered in the genre, and has deeply ingrained in my mind that this is why I love the medium. Some of the story arcs and world building that Mushoku Tensei shows later on are just epic, which I personally can't wait to be animated for other people to see the peak of storytelling that Mushoku Tensei can achieve, to go as far as saying that Mushoku Tensei will go down as the peak of what the isekai genre can do, a true work of art.